Chapter 11. I didn't much like the way Weasel was staring at me. It reminded me of the look in Gideon Thurston's eyes when he'd come to help us at slaughtering time. He'd size up each pig with a long look, so as to decide which one out of the bunch would get its throat cut that day. I didn't aim to wait around to have my throat cut, and I didn't much want to find out what other ideas Weasel might come up with. But I felt as helpless as a pig led to slaughter, hog-tied as I was on the floor. I watched Weasel take another big drink out of the jug, and it gave me an idea. No man could drink as much as Weasel had been drinking without having to answer a call of nature. So far, I hadn't said a word, so as not to take a chance on making Weasel mad. But now I blurted, "I need to go out." Weasel stared at me dumbly. "To the privy," I explained. Weasel laughed and mimicked me. "To the privy, you say? Well, ain't you the fancy one? Well, there's no privy here, boy. You gotta go. You pick any bush you like the look of." "Not a bad idea at that," he mumbled, staggering to his feet. He let out a terrible curse as he put weight down on his shot foot. I waited, still tied, as Weasel lurched toward the cabin door, his hands fumbling with the front of his trousers. "I reckon you'll need to untie me," I said. Weasel stopped for a moment, closing one eye and pining me with the other. "You don't aim to try anything stupid, do you, boy?" "No, sir," I answered, trying to sound respectful. "I just have to go real bad." Weasel picked up Pa's rifle, carried it over, and set it down next to him while he tried to untie my legs, swearing at the knots. Finally, growing impatient, he cut through the ropes with his knife, picked up the rifle, and said, "Go on with you." "I'll need my hands, too," I said just as meekly as I could. Weasel slashed through the ropes that tied my hands and watched scornfully as I forced my cramped legs and arms to move. He pushed me toward the door with the point of the rifle. Both of us were stumbling, but for different reasons. Outside, Weasel kept the rifle pointed at me as he relieved himself in the underbush. I tried to linger as long as I could, taking in every detail of my surroundings. It was still dark, but in one direction I could see a brightening in the sky. That was east. To my right, I heard a familiar nicker and saw the faint outline of Job and nearby Crabby. They were tied up, not fenced. I wondered if Weasel had tended to them at all since he'd taken them. Weasel pushed me roughly with the point of the gun, and I headed inside again, where he gave me a sudden shove that sent me sprawling back to the floor. He swore as he picked up the short pieces that were left of the rope I had been tied with and threw them to the floor in disgust. They were no good now for tying me up, and I wondered what Weasel would do. His eyes were red-rimmed and glassy from pain, and the whiskey had made him mean and impatient and clumsy. Weasel's head swung drunkenly as he searched the room for something to tie me with. He grabbed some pieces of dirty cloth and used them to fasten me to a chair, the only piece of furniture in the room other than the crew table. His hands shook as he struggled with the knots. "You ain't going far with a chair tied to your back," he said, seemingly quite pleased with himself. I tried to look just as helpless and scared as a rabbit. It wasn't hard. I was so scared as I'd ever been, and I must have looked pretty helpless lying sideways on the floor tied up to a chair. Then Weasel grabbed a pile of old animal skins that I figured he used for a bed, dragged them over in front of the door, and lay down on them heavily. His back was propped up against the cabin door. Pa's rifle was on his lap, pointing my way. Casting one bloodshot eye at me, he muttered, "I wouldn't move if I was you, boy," and he closed his eyes. I didn't even think about moving for a long time. I just watched Weasel and tried to puzzle out what to do next. I thought of the first time I had seen Weasel. We were headed west to Ezra's place, and Weasel was headed in the opposite direction, though on the same side of the big river. Pa had said Weasel was a creature of the night, and I reckon he had been going home to sleep as the sun came up. If I was right, I was now somewhere east of Ezra's. If I could escape, I wouldn't waste any time trying to figure out which way to go. I'd head west and hope I soon find familiar territory.